That's
And we are rolling.
okay. Today is Tuesday, March 24th, 2015. I am here with Florence Shapiro, who is going to share some of her thoughts and memories for the family, the community, and for the Dallas Jewish Historical Society archives. Florence, good morning.
Good morning, Janine.
I just wanted to let you begin by telling us about your family, about your parents, and any information you'd like to share with us, with your grandparents, where you were born, all the specifics. Let's start from the beginning.
Okay. We'll start in Berlin, Germany,
Okay.
where my parents were both born. And believe it or not, they didn't know each other in Berlin, Germany. My father came from a very Orthodox family. His life until he was 16 years old was revolved around his family. He had a younger sister, 2 years younger than he was. And it was a typical German Jewish family. I think most of the things he told me about his upbringing was that he was Jewish first, but his father always believed that he was a German, and when the war, rumblings of the war started, his father never believed that the Germans would do anything to destroy his family because he fought in World War I, and as a patriot in Germany, they weren't going to do anything to harm him, so he was in denial. My mother, on the other hand, was an only child. She was several years younger than my dad, and they didn't run in the same circles. And she was an only child and was raised in a fairly wealthy family. My grandfather owned a shoe store in Berlin, and they too never really thought that this would happen in Germany because they had money. And she grew up in a community that she had a lot of Christian friends, and her desire was to stay under the radar, so to speak. So their younger years, they were both fairly young, were really spent as normal children in Berlin, Germany. And then Hitler came to power. My grandfather at Kristallnacht, my mother's father, had his store destroyed, pretty severely beaten through a number of years before the war actually was declared, and had a very, very difficult time. They desperately wanted to get out of Germany. He paid a lot of different people, including Jews, to give them papers, and they ended up hiding in the woods at night. I mean, they did all kinds of things to survive. And finally, after many attempts to get papers to leave, my grandfather was successful in getting papers to leave to London, England. That was in the early 1939, right before the war, actually. So they were safe in England. Unfortunately, because of the beatings, because of the extreme pain and pressure, my grandfather, although he immigrated to England about a year or two later, he died of a heart attack. He was 40 years old, and left my mother and her mother in London during the war. My father, on the other hand, was fortunate that it was available for him to get on a kinder transport, which is a very famous option for young children under the age of 17 to leave Berlin if they were fortunate enough to have someone that would accept them in another country. He was 16 at the time. His parents put him on the kinder transport with his first cousin, my Uncle Leon Dorfman, and they each had a sister they left behind. My father's sister was 2 years younger than he was, and when my grandparents took my father to the boat, my grandmother said, "I don't believe I'm ever going to see you again." And it was true. His sister, who was, as I said, probably 14, we think she survived another year or two, She was taken to concentration camp. His mother and father were taken to concentration camps, and they were killed. And between the family members, there were probably over 35 that were actually killed during the war. My father left on a kinder transport and was taken to London, where a cousin there was less than genuine about helping him, but at least he made it. And he then decided at age 17, which was just another year after that, that he would join the British Army. I believe he was 17 at the time. And he was taken immediately into the intelligence corps. So he really saw the war up close and personal. Spoke English, spoke German. Last name was Dorfman, and he changed it to Martin Donald at the time because it was very British. And he has amazing stories to tell about the war and even after the war. They met after the war in England through some mutual friends, and married in 1947. My grandmother, who was still alive at the time, always wanted to move to the United States, and finally pestered them enough to say, okay, it's 1948, it's time for us to leave. So in January of 1948, they came over on a boat. My mother was pregnant with me at the time. We always laugh and say there's a good possibility I could have been born at sea, but I was born in May of 1948 on my father's birthday, May 2nd, which is of blessed memory and something that is very special to me and always has been. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
And then when I started talking about my family, it would be hard. Because he's no longer with us, as you probably know, as you know.
Yes.
So that's where our life started, was really in New York, with very limited family. Some cousins that my parents had. My mother had very little family. My father actually came from a much larger family, and one set of aunts and uncles had 4 or 5. Had 4 or 5 children, and so as a result of that, I didn't have any aunts or uncles, but I certainly had cousins. But I certainly had cousins, second and third generation cousins. And so while we lived in New York, it was family. I mean, we'd have dinner on Friday nights, and no matter where we were. We lived in 3 different places in New York. I was born in New York City, and then we lived in Brooklyn, and then we lived in Long Island. And my dad was actually in the fur business, which was a trade that he learned back in Germany as a young man, and also in England, and so he followed that path. They used to make furs in New York, and then they would travel in the South, coming to all kinds of big stores and sell their furs. And the South seemed to be a wonderful opportunity. So one of his cousins came to Dallas and sold goods in Dallas, and I was probably in the 4th grade, almost the 5th grade, I think, when they first started talking about moving to Dallas. And of course, back then, Dallas, I mean, I thought we were going to all ride horses, and you had a horse tied to a pole, and
right.
The image back then was very different from what I was used to in New York. By the 5th grade, I was 11, and my parents said, pack your bags, we're moving to Dallas. So we did, and it was a very unusual time. My brother was 2 years younger than I was, and so I was 11 and Mark was 9. Hard age to pick up and leave, really hard age to pick up and leave in any circumstance, but particularly because we knew nobody. Time went on and we acclimated, obviously, and Dallas was wonderful. I mean, we loved it. We participated in a lot of things. My father, as most people know, was one of the originators of the Holocaust Museum. He was very involved. He and Mike Jacobs and Max Glaubin and a handful of people, Bill Schiff. I mean, there were a group of them. And so I grew up all of my life having this burning desire and knowledge and ability to learn more, to want to know more about it. He was very protective, always, of his children. And there were stories he would tell us, but they were limited. My mother, on the other hand, would never speak at all about it. She would begin the tears, and the story, and she couldn't talk. She couldn't talk. To this day, she's not a talker about what happened to her. Periodically, you can get a little story here and there, but basically, she just can't. It's not that she doesn't want to; it's that she just can't. It brings back such harsh memories for her. I think about it a lot when I think about all this bullying that you hear about in the news and in the media, and when you talk to children about bullying. She probably, if anything, that she talks about, the bullying that occurred for her as a child in Berlin was just scarred and marked her for life. Because she thought those children were her friends,
Right.
and they turned on her on a dime. And one day they were her friend, and the next day the Germans said, "Don't talk to those dirty people." And so her life just changed dramatically. And it reminds me of what's going on in the world today, of course.
So take me back a little bit to when you moved to Dallas. Where were you in Dallas? What was Dallas like at the time? What do you remember?
Oh my, this was 1960. And Dallas was, we lived in North Dallas. In fact, I can tell you exactly where we lived. We lived on the street called Jamestown, which is right, there was a Skiller's in the shopping center at Preston and Forest in the southwest corner, and our house was the backyard of Skiller's, the back of Skiller's, on Jamestown, right on the corner. I wish I could remember the address, but I can't. But it was on Jamestown was the street. What I remember most about that was really going to Sherith Israel and connecting with the group of Jewish kids my age at Sherith Israel. And one of my very best friends today, 60 years later, almost 60 years later, I actually met at Sherith Israel. It was high holidays. I remember this like it was yesterday. Boy, that's a terrible thing. Don't ask me what I had for breakfast today, but I can tell you what happened that day. I remember distinctly we were in as 11 and 12 and 13-year-olds do, they get tired and bored in the service, and they come into the restroom, and I don't know if you remember, but it's probably still there. There's this giant mirror, so the girls were all kind of fluttering around the mirror, and my mother was a milliner. She made hats, and I was wearing this little this little hat. It was leopard, and looking in the mirror, and a girl looked at me and she said, "Well, why are you wearing that hat?" And it started up a conversation. Well, it was Betty Silverman, and we just began to talk, and she kind of put me at ease, and it was kind of a chattery thing, and we didn't go to the same elementary school. I was at Pershing, and she was at Preston Hollow, but when we met up at Benjamin Franklin, we became very good friends, and her friends became my friends, and my friends became her friends, and that was a group of friends that have had a lasting relationship even today. And it all started with Betty and I at Congregation Sherith Israel.
And I assume that most of these kids were not children of Holocaust survivors.
I don't really know. I don't think so. I mean, Betty certainly wasn't, and so I don't think so. They weren't all Jewish. I mean, we kind of started in a group of friends that were not all Jewish. Betty and I were friends with a lot of people that were not Jewish. Although we still had our Jewish roots, and we still did a lot of things. We both were in BBYO, and we did, we did a lot of things, but it wasn't that we just went solely with that group of Jewish friends. So I think part of that discussion, I'm going to have to now hope that the dog is going to be okay. Do you want me to? Okay. So part of that discussion really is the relationship that I had with my friends about my religion, around my religion. And it was an interesting time. It was an interesting time.
Do you remember how you felt towards your parents at that time?
Yes, that's a very good question. I was a first-generation American, and I knew more, I thought. I knew more than they did. I kind of taught them the mores and the things that were acceptable or unacceptable at that particular part of my growing up. I can very, very easily remember when my mother would make me lunch. You know, you'd always wanted to do what everybody else did.
Right.
So I asked her to get brown paper bags because everybody was bringing a brown paper bag to school. So she used the big brown paper bags that you get the whole grocery out of. And I was just mortified. But she didn't know, when I said a brown paper bag, it was a brown paper bag. So little things like that. I think I kind of helped them transition into what was the value system that we were now engaged in. And my father was a much more worldly person than my mother was, and so he had those values, I think, already from business. My mother was a little slower to catch on because she wasn't exposed to it.
So you talked about your family being at Sheriff and BBYO. Were there any other organizations that kids were involved in at that time?
Not really, not that I can think of. I mean, not Jewish, no, not really. I became very engaged in my school. I was on the student council. I was on the drill team. I was in junior high. In high school, I was class favorite in the 10th grade. In the 11th grade, I was on the drill team in the 10th grade. I was one of the officers of the student council. In the 11th grade, it was 11th grade, I was class favorite. I can't remember one of them. Shows you how long ago that was. At Hillcrest High School. And then I was a cheerleader at Hillcrest, but first Jewish cheerleader. So my friends were Jewish, but some were Jewish, but I wasn't in the BBYO scene solely. And that kind of faded a little bit. But one thing I always knew throughout all of that was that when I got to college, there was no doubt in my mind, never a doubt in my mind, that I would then begin transitioning to a more Jewish crowd. I wanted to be in a Jewish sorority. I wanted to marry a Jewish man. It never entered my mind to do anything but that. It was almost like I got a reprieve for a period of time from my family, knowing that that would be my major goal at the end of the day. And so I never, they would love for me to have dated. And I dated some Jewish boys. It wasn't like I didn't date Jewish boys. I did. But it was just different for me.
More experiment.
At that time. But when I went to college, I mean, I wouldn't have traded that for anything. And I was very engaged at that point in the Jewish sorority and Jewish life. But even at the University of Texas, I was in organizations that were very different from. I mean, each sorority had one or two that were in a certain organization. Like I was in what was then called Spooks, which is now called Spirits. I was in Orange Jackets. I was in a group called Posse. I mean, I was in those kinds of things that were selective, but it was always through the sorority that I was engaged.
Were there any experiences or people who impacted your life at that point?
When I was in college, yes, my big sister in the sorority. She and I were very much alike and very outgoing, popular. She was one of those everybody looked up to, and she was engaged in all of these kinds of activities. So she would take me along, and then I would become, involved in it as well. So she really, I like to say that she's one of the reasons that I became kind of the personality that I became, was really, and it's Carol. Her name was Carol Goldman, and she's now Carol Minker, and she's from Fort Worth, and we're still very close.
It's interesting.
She likes to say that whatever I am today, she created.
Cute.
It is cute.
When did Howard come into the picture?
Oh, what a great question. This is a story Howard likes to tell, and I don't like to tell it, but I will. We were freshmen at the University of Texas. He had pledged Sammy, and I had pledged AFI, and it was the sorority day where they came around, and I can't even believe we did this, but they pledged night, and then they came and picked people to go out with for the rest of the week, and somehow he came and asked me to go out Friday night of this long week that everybody was going out. And I said yes. And he was from a very small town in central Texas. Most people have no idea where it is. He's from a town, San Saba. I like to tell people that if you look at a map of Texas and you see the word Texas on it, he lived under the X. So his growing up was very different from mine, vastly different from mine. They were the only Jewish family, but his father was the mayor of the city. He was probably the strongest figure that, along with another man, in that community. Actually in Central Texas, his father was very, very active in many organizations, Jewish and non-Jewish. So he had that influence on Howard at the time too, for public service. But the story that goes with it is not such a great one, because as Friday night came, or Friday afternoon came, Howard called and broke the date with me for Friday. And I was incensed. I mean, how could somebody do that? You plan on Sunday and you're at Friday. And I later found out, he said he was sick. I later found out he decided to go back to San Saba for the football game. And I was livid. I wouldn't talk to him for almost a year, a little bit more than a year, maybe even a year and a couple of months afterwards. I just didn't want to have anything to do with him. It was really insulting for me, particularly for, to think that someone thought that was more important than a date. So why waste my time on him? So, and then about a year or so later, a friend of mine and a friend of his said, you guys really need to bury the hatchet and go out. And so we did, and then we never dated anybody else. And went together for about a year and a half, almost 2 years, got engaged in July of 1969, and actually we were going to wait and get married in June of 70 when we graduated, but we decided to do it in December, so we got married in December of 1969. We've been married 45 years. 46 in December, and he had 9 hours left on his in business school at UT, and I was doing my student teaching. So we got married, and he wanted to go to law school, and he was accepted at SMU. So we came to Dallas with the promise that we would go back to Austin because he loved Austin. I had different ideas. My family was here, and obviously I was very close with my family, and I wanted to stay in Dallas. So that was the time in our life. I was teaching at Richardson High School. I was a high school English and speech teacher, which was a phenomenal experience for me right out of college. And he was at SMU in law school, and we ultimately decided that Plano was a nice small town to move to, and he started clerking for a lawyer in Plano in 1971, and I had to stop teaching in 1972 in May because I was pregnant with my first child, Lisa, and I never went back to teaching, but education was always a passion for me. So many years fast forward, I got very engaged in education issues. He ultimately graduated from law school, and we moved to Plano. It's a very small town, 17,500 people. I had no idea that Plano was on the other side of Richardson, never growing up in North Dallas. And it was the perfect match for us because I had my parents and the big city, and he had a small town, and it was a great place to raise a family. The schools were great. I mean, everything about Plano just fit our needs.
So there were 17,000 people in what year?
1972.
1972.
17,500 people in 1972. Yeah.
And I know in 1979, if I remember correctly, you were running for office because there was a large sign on West Park, that said Florence Shapiro, City Council, and I believe your picture was on it. How did that come about?
Probably an outgrowth of everything that I've just described to you about my life. I'm a type A personality. Most people will have to agree with that. I'm very gregarious and outgoing. I know my strengths and weaknesses, and I enjoy people. And in those years before 1979, from 1972 to 1979, Plano was a small town, but it was starting to grow. And there were many activities going on that needed leadership. I can remember vividly the women's division of the Chamber of Commerce didn't have any place to meet. The Chamber of Commerce was meeting in a trailer on 15th Street. Harry Thompson was the man's name, who was actually the executive director of the chamber. He resigned, and the women's division took turns working in the office. I mean, that's how desperate they were for people to come in and help as volunteers. So I began really the process of working in the community with friends like Sherry Small, who was a friend from many years ago, Sherry Waldman Small, and many others, Carolyn Dickey, Jenny McCall, all of my friends that we'd become friends through a lot of our children were friends, or we knew other people who knew people that we met in Plano at that time. And we just started picking up the slack and doing the things that needed to be done. In 1974, we started what was called the Information and Referral Center, where people could go if they had needs. In 1976, along with my very good friend Maureen Dickey, who now is in Dallas, she came to me one day and she said, "I think we need to start a junior league in Plano." And I said, "Really? Why?" And she said, "Because women are really active and they want to volunteer." And I said, "Well, that sounds good." And we investigated it and found out that you couldn't be just a junior league. You had to be a service league first. Mm-hmm. So we started with the Plano Service League with 13 women. I was the first president and founder along with Maureen. And the next year, Maureen moved to Dallas. So I was in charge. We started with 13 women, and today I'm proud to tell you at 2015, it's now the Junior League of Collin County. Mm-hmm. And there are over 1,000 women engaged in really wonderful activities throughout the Collin County community. Things like that kind of started, maybe somebody else's idea, but I participated in it, mm-hmm. really put me at the forefront of what was going on in Plano. And it was a wonderful place to be. In 1979, there was a woman on the Plano City Council by the name of Louise Sherrill. She was the publisher of the newspaper, the Plano Star-Courier, still published today. And she decided not to run for city council again. And a couple of gentlemen came to me and said, "We want you to run for city council. You need to fill the woman's seat." I said, What? The who? And they said that's the woman's seat, and we need another woman to run, and we think you should run. Well, another insult, of course. What do you mean the woman's seat? But back then, it wasn't as bad, except you could feel the underpinnings of it, even back then. And my election in 1979 was very obvious. I had 3 small children. Lisa was 6, Todd was 4, and Stacy was 9 months. But they told me it was at night. The story, Janine, I'm sure you've heard from Charles, and that you do it on your own time during the week, and the meetings were on Monday nights, every other week, and it just didn't sound like it was a real burden at the time, and it sounded exciting. So I decided to run. This was in 1979. Back then, women usually didn't have jobs, and they didn't work, other than teaching or nursing. And there was a forum for the candidates. There were 2 men and myself that ran in this seat. And a man in the audience asked a question, and he raised his hand and he stood up and he said, "Mrs. Shapiro, do you have a family?" And I said, "Yes, I have a husband and 3 children," and I gave their age. And he said, "Don't you think you ought to be home taking care of your children instead of running for city council?" At which I paused, and I didn't really know quite what to say at the time. And then I said, "Sir, I'd really like to meet your wife." And I just left it at that. And it was tough back then. I mean, there were people who were very judgmental. Why would you do so? Why would a woman do this? Mm-hmm. Particularly one that had small children. And it was interesting times. It was very interesting. I won by 35 votes. Of course, back then I didn't have very many people voting, but we started calling me Landslide Shapiro. And that was the first year that I really got engaged in public service in a city council as a public. I consider myself a public servant, but a lot of people say politician. And it was all about serving the community and helping the community grow and making decisions for the community that I was going to live in for the rest of my life. There was no doubt in my mind we were staying in Plano. I mean, it was my home. So the next year, a man ran against me, and I beat him 80% to 20%. And for the next 4 terms, I had no opposition. So it was very comfortable, and I was thoroughly engaged and enjoying every minute of what I was doing. I was helping to build a community.
Were there any special experiences or situations that occurred that you remember and that changed anything that you did?
I think the most significant thing on the city council, and I was president of the Economic Development Board, which was really a big thing because everything was burgeoning and growing. But the most significant piece that I remember, and I remember a lot, but is when Ross Perot came to Plano and said he envisions he's going to buy 3,000 acres in far west Plano, and he's going to build another downtown Dallas. And we went, psh, no way, it's a pipe dream. Well, he was a visionary. And I to this day, I always say Ross Perot Sr. / visionary. He saw something that no one else saw, and he created an environment in Plano that it cannot be duplicated, in my opinion. Many cities, Allen, Frisco, McKinney, are all trying to duplicate, but at that time and that place, what he created there was spectacular. And I was a part of that. I mean, I went to New York to lure J.C. Penney to come. I was a part of the Frito-Lay decision. I mean, it was a part of my life. It became so significant because I could use my talents to engage in what I believed in, which was my community, and get people to buy into what we were selling, which was the community. So it was a wonderful time, and probably one of the most significant things that we did while I was on the city council.
Did you ever feel as if your Jewishness interfered with?
Never. And I'm so glad you asked that, because I know I was going to say that in a minute, but never. My Judaism was never an issue, ever, while I was on the city council. Did people say things behind my back? I don't know. Was it obvious in anything that happened? Was anything written about it? Was there? No, absolutely not. But, and there's a very big but that goes with that. I actually, in 1990, I decided to run for mayor. I actually didn't care much about being the mayor. The moniker didn't matter to me. But in 1990, I decided that there needed to be a change in leadership in the mayor's role, and I decided to run against the sitting mayor, and I did, and he dropped out of the race. So I was the mayor for 2 years. And then in 1992, a very good friend of mine by the name of Kay Bailey Hutchison and her husband, Ray Hutchison, came to me and said, there's been a redistricting in Texas, and the new Senate district, and that time was Senate District 2, now is going to be Collin County, mostly Plano, and go from Plano to Tyler, East Texas. And it is a Republican district. We believe it can be won by a Republican. There is an incumbent Democrat who has a lot of issues that people don't really like him, and we think you're the candidate to run for the Senate. So after much discussion with Howard, and I have never run for office without Howard's permission. I know that sounds silly, and he would never agree that it was permission, because many times he said, oh, I just don't know if this is a good idea, but I could be very persuasive. And at the end, he would usually say, you're going to do it, and I'll support you. And my children. I mean, this was a big step. This was not mommy at home anymore, but my kids were grown at this time, except for Stacy. Stacy was still at home. She was a junior in high school. She was a sophomore when I ran, but a junior when I went off to Austin. So no anti-Semitism, no anything for a long time. But I ran in a Republican primary. There were 2 men again, and myself. One of them was the same mayor that that had gone out of the race. who subsequently went to the federal penitentiary, by the way. And the other man was from Tyler, very religious man in Tyler. In fact, his brochures had he and his wife and his 2 sons outside a church with Bibles under their arms, obviously pointed at me. Undercurrents, no one ever said anything out loud, but very, very obvious undercurrents of anti-Semitism, very obvious. We had a runoff. During the runoff, we had big billboards that were in East Plano, and I came back to the office one day after a trip to Tyler, and the gal that was running my Senate office was just beside herself, and she said, "I have something terrible to tell you. 2 of your billboards on the corner of Jupiter and 15th have been defaced, and they say Jew on it and swastikas." And it was devastating to me. The Dallas Morning News came out. I mean, it was huge. And all that I could think about at that moment when she said that to me, A, were my children, and B, were my parents, who were so very proud of their being Americans. One of the things I didn't tell you, and why they were so proud, I think, is I was, in 1986, I believe it was, now I can't remember the year, 1984, the Chamber of Commerce had a thing called Citizen of the Year, still have it, and I was named Citizen of the Year in Plano. And the room was dark, and they were doing a video, and I didn't know my parents were in the room, and all I could say when I got up to the podium, because it was a surprise, was, "Oh, I wish my parents were here. They would not believe it. They were not allowed to be citizens in their home country, and the idea that their daughter would be Citizen of the Year is just more than I think they would probably be able to stand." And sure enough, the lights went up and my parents were there. So my first thoughts when that happened was where are my parents? What are my parents gonna think? I mean, what? And the next day it was on the front page of the Dallas Morning News. It was very hard. It was very, very hard because it hadn't happened before. Thank you. And the reality set in for me, and it brought back memories of what my parents used to say about Berlin and about Germany and about their growing up. It's a hard, hard road, but it made me more determined than ever before. Not just to win the race, but to win over the people that I believed didn't think I was the right person for the job. And so that kind of became a very important part of my life, and motivated me to do the right thing and to do good work.
How were the family reactions to all of this? The children, how were the parents? The children, I think, it was easier for them than it was my parents. My parents, I think, all of that angst and all of that stuff just started coming back out, and I think that caused some problems for them, my mother in particular. Mm-hmm. My dad was a very strong man. I mean, he was a German. He was a very strong man, and he said, you've just got to overcome this, and what we've got to do is we've got to just plow forward and not look back. My children, on the other hand, I think really felt that they needed that strength and that uplifting from the whole family. It was one of those things that you just everybody had to get together and just keep going. And fortunately, I defeated the guy from Tyler, and then I ran against the Democrat opponent. There were still some underpinnings of anti-Semitism even at that time, but we won and we moved on, and the rest is history. In Austin, Texas, during the legislative sessions or throughout my career as a legislator, I do not remember any incident of anti-Semitism that I recognized. Back rooms, back talk, who knows? But never blatant and never like that again. And while you were in Austin, Stacy was in Austin.
Actually, Todd was in Austin.
Okay.
Right. Stacy was in Austin also, yes. But they both came to the University of Texas. Todd was there for his 4 years, and then he was also there for law school for 3 years. So that was always fun. It was being around them. We always had a wonderful time. They loved coming to the Capitol, and they were engaged. Todd was very engaged in a lot of things. Stacy was on the student government at UT. Todd was in an organization called Texas Cowboys, also both in Jewish sororities, very, very Jewish oriented their whole lives as well. Lisa was over at the University of Arizona in Tucson, and then came back to Texas to go to SMU Law School. Todd stayed there for law school, and Stacy went to graduate school at Austin. So it sounds like Austin would be another drawback, but we were so embedded here in Plano. Fortunately, two of them are back in Plano, raising their families in Plano. Lisa moved to Houston with her husband, Brian Strauss, who is a rabbi. And she has 3 children, my 3 oldest grandchildren. They are 14, 11, and 10. My next is Todd, and he lives in Plano. He's an attorney with Howard, and he has 4 children. He's married to Jory Goldstein, who also is from Dallas, and they have 4 children, and they're age 10. I have 12 grandchildren. Give me a minute to think of their ages. Ella's 10, and Zach is 7. And Olivia is 5, and Harper is 2. Harper's 2. And then Stacy, the baby, is here with her husband, Paul. Paul's a pediatric dentist, and he's from Hallettsville. Now, isn't that interesting that she picked someone from a really small town? Just like her father, they have 5 children. They have Sam, who's 9, Sophie, Natalie, who's 7, Sophie, who's 5, and when they wanted a 4th, God gave them twins. So we have Eli and Brody, who are about 14 months old. And we are blessed beyond words, in my opinion. I often said in many of my speeches, and believe me, I've given thousands of speeches in my career, I've often said that God put me on this earth to be the bridge between my parents and their past and my children and their future. And I believe that with all my heart. And I'm probably most proud of my children, their choices for spouses, all Jewish, I might add, and their children. It is the greatest gift that I could have ever given to my parents. And at the same time, I think Hitler burns just a little more in hell.
Well, I do think that there are so many questions to ask you. But right now, aside from being the bridge, what message would you like your grandchildren to grow up knowing?
I want them to know their past. I don't want them to dwell on their past, because I think my parents don't want them to do that. They didn't want me to, but I want them to know it, and I want them to be proud of it. And I want them to take that as a message to others about tolerance, about every person in humanity is important and special in their own way, and use that as a guiding force in their lives. I just believe that, and I believe that people need to get that message. And if through me they can get that message, and through my parents they can get that message, and they share that with their immediate whoever, family, friends, acquaintances, then I think they'll be better for it, and I think that their community will be better for it. And that's 12 grandchildren. That's a lot of seeds being planted in a lot of places, thank God.
If you were to talk about what award, because I know you've received a lot of awards over the years, which one was the most meaningful to you and why?
Oh my goodness, I'm not sure I can answer that. I have been blessed. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I have been blessed with a lot of awards. You know, I'm going to say this, and I don't want it to sound trite because I don't think it is. I hope it doesn't come out trite. They're really not important to me. You know, at the moment, all of those were special. Being Citizen of the Year in 1984, I gave you the reasons. Being involved in the Holocaust and being honored by the Holocaust Museum, the Hope for Humanity Award was amazing. Getting the award for the Israeli Bond Dinner. I mean, you know, I could name a lot. I could name, you know, scholarships that have been done in my name. Probably scholarships in my name are more meaningful than anything. You know, I would give speeches and I'd get awards for the speeches. I made the commitment a couple of years ago, once I realized I was not running anymore. When people asked me, you know, I told my staff at the time, you know, when somebody wants to give me a plaque or something, please tell them, take the $25 and put it in a scholarship or buy books for the library. If I could wave a magic wand and go back in time, I don't even want to tell you the hundreds and hundreds of awards and plaques that I got. That if people just took that $10 or that $25 or that $50, some of them are huge, and put it in a Florence Shapiro scholarship or any scholarship or donated it to the library, hundreds and thousands of dollars could potentially have been given away. It's meaningless after you're done. What really matters is the lives you touch and the people that you meet along the way. People ask me all the time, you know, what do you miss most about being in Austin? I said, relationships. It's not the process. It's my friends. It's the relationships with people. Some I still have very close relationships to, and I wouldn't trade that for anything.
Florence, this has been wonderful.
Thank you.
One more
Thank you.
question.
Thank you.
Greatest achievement.
Okay. So what would you consider is your greatest achievement?
This sounds corny, and I mean, you know, I shouldn't say I don't mean for it to, because I wouldn't say it if I didn't think it was true. The 12 grandchildren. I think in your life, everything you do as you grow up and as you mature is important to you. They're all important. We all know that everything we do is important, and it builds on who you are. But at this point in my life, it's 66 years old, as I look back and I look forward, I think the future is bright and gives me hope because of my grandchildren. And I stay engaged in what I do in education and the things that I care about because of my grandchildren. So I have to say that my greatest accomplishment may not even be relevant yet, and maybe we'll have to look back when they become adults. Please God that I'm around. But I believe that will be the greatest accomplishment, is what I get to embody in them, what Howard and I, as parents and grandparents, get to give those children, and hope to engage them in the life that we believe is so important, and their Judaism. So.
One thing we didn't talk about is Howard running for school board.
Oh, he was on the school board.
Right. Mm-hmm. How did that affect you being on city council?
You know, it was so strange because that was really a fluky thing that happened. But I was on the city council and he decided he wanted to run for school board. Well, who was I to say no? I mean, you know, I was, you know, we didn't have meetings on the same night, so that was helpful. It made for strange dinner conversation. But again, he was very engaged in the school, and I was very engaged in city work, and it didn't really, we didn't contradict each other, because it was all about growth and development of the community. But Howard's a very outspoken person. He doesn't take a back seat to anybody. It didn't bother him that people said, well, you know, why are you doing this? Your wife's on the city council. And he was a wonderful school board member. I mean, he was very outspoken and really made some pretty bold decisions while he was on the school board, in hopes that they would be the right decisions for the students in the schools. So I was very proud of him for what he did. It was not easy.
Do you see any of the children following in any of your footsteps?
I don't know. Lisa, in her own way, is very engaged in public service. She's an attorney in Houston, but she does mostly court appointments and a lot of she's really engaged in that kind of public service element. I see she might run for something someday. Todd, I would hope, might do something, but not yet. I mean, they've got very small children. Stacy is a volunteer extraordinaire.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she is. She really has the heart of a philanthropist. I mean, she's got the desire and the heart to help people. She was a social worker, and now she's got the desire and the heart to help 5 children. So she's got her boat overloaded, but she still volunteers for so much in the Jewish community. I mean, I'm so proud of the work that she's doing as well. So I don't know. Time will be the best judge. Do any of them say I aspire to that? Absolutely not. Did I aspire to run for public office? Absolutely not. It just was something that happened. As they say, life happens while you're doing something else. And it just became a part of my life. 30 years of public service. It's a long time. I always said I was going to be in the Senate for 12 years, and then I was going to leave because I didn't think you needed to stay any longer than that. And at year 18, I looked around and said, how did that happen? What am I doing here? And that's when I decided it was time to get off the stage and move on.
And you decided not to follow in Kay Bailey Hutchinson's footsteps.
You know, it was a thought of mine for a while when she first decided that she wasn't going to run, but then she backed off. And it took another year and a half before she actually decided not to run, or didn't run. And by then, the desire just had gone out of my system, and so I didn't do it. Things have changed in Texas in politics dramatically over the last 10 years, really the last 5 years. And we can get into a whole nother video on that, and we don't want to do that. But it's just not the same. It was a passion for me as a public servant. I want to remain a public servant. And politics are very hard and harsh and angry right now, and that has to pass. We can't let that dominate our political world.
Any other thoughts or insights to either politics or your family or the community, the Jewish community?
I don't know where to go with that. I guess the most important thing for me to end with would be Lador Vador, from generation to generation. I think as each of us looks at our family, looks back on the family that we had, looks forward on the family that we have in the future, I think we have to remember that we are a series of families. No one is an island. We all come from a long line of history, and we should embrace that history, and we should learn from it, and we should pass it on.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.